McQuestion. For over 25 years, talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuestion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, CF Accountants and Consultants, adding value to clients throughout the region, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
You know, when the McQuestion program premiered in 1990, the price of oil was about $15 to $22 a barrel. As you'll see on this chart, however, there have been some real ups and downs. This program is the second in a three-part series on oil. And in part one, we discuss the history of oil up to 1990. On this program, we'll examine the events of the last 25 years. We'll discuss peak oil, energy security, and yes, fracking. So let's meet the panel. Beginning on my left is Barry Crossman. He spent his entire business career in the energy field, primarily with Caltex, which is a multinational joint venture of Chevron and Texaco. Barry, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
You're the guy who knows everything about the history of oil, so we appreciate that very much. And you're sitting next to another real expert in the industry, and that's Ed Blessing. He's an independent oil operator. He's a frequent guest on this program, and he's a board member of Petro Victory, where they're now drilling a well in Paraguay. So, Ed, welcome back to the program.
It's good to be here, Dennis.
We're going to look at a bunch of clips on this program that you're in, by the way. But first, I want you to tell that viewer what peak oil is, and then why we were talking about it 9 years ago on this program.
Well, peak oil, I think Barry knows much better than I do. Peak oil is always right around the corner, and a number of people have said we're there. And I think you and I first met back in 2004 or 5, when peak oil was here. It was coming. The Saudis were about ready to run out. All the oil that could be found had been found. We were producing. We were running dry. We weren't going to meet our needs. And as you said, Hubbard was there. And it seemed like there were a number of books that came out in 2002, 3, and 4, ending with Twilight in the Desert by our good friend, then it stopped for a while, and now I think it's coming back. We're now running out of hydrocarbons, and I think as Barry spent some time in Baku, and I followed him there, where they drilled the first well. How long ago, Barry?
1846.
And that field, I'd love to have it. If it was in East Texas, we'd make a lot of money from it, because they haven't finished with it yet. So.
You would. Now, Barry, when's your first memory of peak oil when people were talking about it back in your career?
Oh, in the 60s they were talking about it, and again in the 70s and in the 80s. But even in the late 20s, not during my time, but in the late 20s, that was one of the reasons why Congress enacted some of the import-export restrictions on U.S. oil, because they thought that fields would decline, and somehow they didn't have faith that we'd find new fields. But as we've seen over the decades, we keep finding new stuff.
All right, well, I'm going to play a series of videos that go back to about 2006, and some of those go back a little further than that. But we had a guy on named Jeffrey Brown, who was a peak oil aficionado,
Yes.
a sort of a aficionado of King Hubbard, who sort of predicted when Texas was going to peak, and then was talking about that, and then Matt Simmons was involved. So let's look at that first video clip with Scott Nauman of Exxon.
Technology has taught us that each time we estimate the world's recoverable resource, it gets bigger and bigger. The USGS, they've done 5 updates since 1980, each one bigger than the one before. Our experience is the same. We have tremendous technologies that are going to help us recover more and more of that oil in place. I'll give you examples. 10, 15 years ago, who would have thought that we could produce oil from 4,000 feet of water off West Africa? But we do that today. Who would have thought that we could drill wells that go horizontally under the ground 6 miles and yet hit a target the size of this studio? Technology is fantastic. And so one of the things I think that gives me confidence that this resource base, which is probably greater than 4 trillion and growing, is the fact that we've got technology that's going to continue to improve with time.
Okay, Jeffrey.
2 points. Texas peaked in '72. We've tried almost everything Scott mentioned. Horizontal drilling, primary, secondary, tertiary recovery, 3D seismic. Texas oil production has fallen for 33 years. We're producing about 1/4 of our peak production. Second thing, North Sea peaked roughly 30 years after Texas and lower 48. a whole generation of better technology. It peaked at roughly the same point as lower 48 and Russia.
Okay, Barry, there's a guy saying, look, it's just right around the corner. That was 2006.
How wrong he's been proven. Because we keep finding new fields to replace those that weren't before. And we keep finding other places to drill for oil and find oil. And the seismic technology that we have has improved dramatically so that you don't have to drill as many dry wells to find a producing well. And so everything is changing in the industry, and we should not leave out the ability of us to find oil if the price is right.
And Dennis, the technology has changed. I mean, it used to be we'd drill straight down, and if we went through a 20-foot zone, we'd frack it and whoopee. Now we go to a 20-foot zone, and as Scott just said, we can drill for miles along that distance and then frack around that, and somebody can explain to me how fracking became a dirty word.
Okay, well, let's first of all tell that viewer. There may be one viewer here who doesn't know what fracking is. So let's first of all ask you to tell us what fracking is, and I'm going to show you that graphic that you and Ben's put together about fracking and horizontal drilling. So tell us what fracking is first of all.
Well, it's merely putting fluids down, and Barry can probably do a better job than I am, but putting fluids down under pressure into the shale, which tends to fracture, which the word fracking came from, and release whatever natural gas is trapped in that. And it used to be we only drill vertically, that if we'd go through a 6-foot zone, all we'd get was 6 foot 360 around. Now, as Scott said, we get down to that zone and we can turn at right angles and go for 6 miles. So, I would argue with somebody, it's not the ability to frack, it's the ability to fly that bit. Barry, underground, you just fly it.
Yeah. All right, let's look at graphic 10, and I think it'll pretty well illustrate what you're talking about here. And so there's your hydraulic fracturing, which is what we call fracking. You're breaking all that up. But the thing you really we're talking about, Ed, is this idea of horizontal drilling, and that's a pretty good graphic to look at it, to say the least. And we talked on the first program about slant hole drilling, where we were trying to get onto somebody else's reservoir, but here we're not drilling down till we find a reservoir, we're dealing crossways, right? And we're fracking all the stuff that's there and releasing liquids and gas, correct?
Yeah, and we talk about fracking. Dan and Jurgen used to talk about, we worry about the risks underground. The risks above ground are the worst ones, politics, and seriously, in government, wars, and all that sort of thing happens above ground. That's where the biggest problem is.
Yeah.
And I want somebody to tell me how fracking became a dirty word.
Well, I don't know that Jurgen will have that answer, but as you may recall, I got an opportunity to interview Dan Jurgen about 3 years ago. He wrote The Quest, he wrote The Prize, probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on oil and gas and energy.